Hello, everyone. My name is Aurélie Frelay, and I'm an assistant teaching professor here at Syracuse and a member of our lecture committee. I want to welcome you all to Housing and the Black Community, hosted by Ifeoma Ebo and Nathan Williams, and co-produced by the Black Space Urbanist Collective. Thank you so much for coming. Before we start, just a couple of notes. A quick reminder about some features you'll see in this Zoom webinar. The chat function is disabled, so the organizers and panelists will address the questions via the Q&A function. You're welcome to send questions through the Q&A at any time during the lecture by clicking the Q&A button, but the panelists will answer your questions after the discussion. We also have live captioning available for this event, so if you would like to enable this feature, please click on the closed captioning button and click Show Subtitles. And now for tonight's event, I'm very pleased to introduce Ifeoma Ebo. Ifeoma is an accomplished urban designer, planner, architect, strategist who harnesses design and management capabilities to lead projects in architecture, urban revitalization, community, large-scale master planning, infrastructure upgrading, urban policy, and neighborhood development. She has held leadership positions in New York City government and is a highly sought-after consultant on equitable design and sustainable development strategy for city governments and civic institutions internationally. Her work emphasizes a commitment to social justice and design excellence. At the Department of Housing and Preservation and Development, she leads pre-development planning and urban design initiatives for the Office of Neighborhood Strategies. Previously, she served as the Director of Strategic Design Initiatives with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, where she led interagency design and built environments initiatives exploring the use of design to address public safety and social justice in marginalized communities across New York City. Her pursuit of design justice led her to spend several years in South Africa, creating strategies to reverse the impacts of apartheid on the built environment for organizations such as Architecture for Humanity and the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. She currently serves on advisory boards for the Mayor of Helsingborg, Sweden H22 Smart City Initiative, Association for Community Design, and the New York City-based collective Black Space, a coalition of Black creatives focused on developing design and neighborhood strategies for Black communities. She has shared her urban design and justice expertise in the academic sphere with visiting critic and lecturing positions at Cornell University, Columbia University, and Syracuse University. Ifeoma holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University and a Master in City Design and Development from MIT. Welcome, Ifeoma.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening for this really interesting discussion. I want to thank my partner in crime for this studio, Nathan Williams, whose creative gifting and insight push students to expand their creative and critical thinking. Thanks to the guidance and support of Dean Speaks and other professors at Syracuse whose guidance were instrumental to the success of this studio, the various collectives, the Black Reconstructions Collective, Dark Matter University, and the Black Space Urbanist Collective for their involvement at various stages of the studio, and to the residents of Pioneer Homes for opening up their lives, their journeys, and their hopes with us and our students. This studio was a 2-month experiment in applying principles of design justice in the context of public housing in Syracuse. It challenged designers to be active, thoughtful, and courageous participants in the creative co-imagining of Pioneer Homes through poetry, collage, photography, moving images, constructed perspective, and digital visualizations. Students articulated their understandings of the impacts of institutional racism on the built environment and the construction of narratives of place and of people and of a people. Although not perfect, and with the time permitted, we attempted to engage community in creative dialogue about history, cultural heritage, social, cultural, economic, and environmental injustice, and reimagining new narratives for space and place. A 15-minute walk from the Syracuse campus, the 15th ward in the city of Syracuse, was once a vibrant middle-class neighborhood. The construction of major interstate I-81 destroyed this predominantly African-American community. Included in this neighborhood is Pioneer Homes, one of the first public housing projects in New York State and the nation. Since the construction of the interstate, Similar social and economic policy decisions have limited this neighborhood's potential growth to equal its former neighborhood strength and community influence. Despite the current challenges, it has been the home to generations of families that have produced banking, medical, legal, sports, and business professionals, to name a few. This is one neighborhood, like many others across the country, that have experienced the legacy of redlining, a discriminatory practice by which banks and insurance companies refuse to or limited loans and mortgages with specific geographic areas, especially in inner city neighborhoods. And that was demarcated on a map in the form of red lines. You can see that on the map on the right. As well as urban renewal, a complete erasure of an existing fabric of a community, all in the name of redevelopment. As well as the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which across the country, highways were developed across the country, which decimated mostly low-income and African-American communities. Currently, there are plans by the New York State Department of Transportation to replace the current I-81 viaduct. This presents a transformational opportunity for the community for redevelopment spearheaded by a nonprofit, Blueprint 15, in partnership with the Syracuse Housing Authority and many other government partners. These ideas for reimagining pioneer homes in the East Adams neighborhood will be the main focus of the following panel discussion. The collective. The Black Space Manifesto was used as a lens for analyzing historical narratives of place and reimagining projected narratives for the future for students in their work. This manifesto was created by the Black Space Urbanist Collective, and it is 14 principles to build the capacity for built environment practitioners to work in Black communities with dignity and respect, using the process and product of design to transform challenges into community strength. For more information, please visit blackspace.org. Reckoning with the past to build the future. This was the students' first prompt. Reckoning is understanding the story of place with a different perspective and repositioning the gaze. Students explore topics of segregation, migration, displacement, Black enclave, and cultural urbanism. This is an image of before and after the impact of the Federal Highways Act on Ward 15. Enclave. Reckoning is understanding the story of place from a different perspective and position, repositioning the gaze. Searching history to understand how Black enclaves are created. Segregation. Students explore the impact of redlining and the ways that it created wounds on the urban landscape, much like laceration, abrasion, and grafting on human skin. Segregation. Red lines drawn around communities, the urban landscape, used as a divider between white lines and Black lines, but also the introduction of law enforcement, manifested as blue lines, further perpetuating separation. Cultural urbanism. Students learn from the rich lineage of quilt culture and Underground Railroad coded motifs to communicate the metaphor of displacement and oppression woven into the existing Syracuse culture. The journey of liberation still persists within the urban fabric of the Syracuse community. And what they perceive as white American quilt culture does not exist without the persistence of Black talent, despite oppression. Students use creative drawing to express the current absurdity of the city's intervention on domestic life by representing distorted and fractured realities. Displacement. The Students learned about the power of media in crafting a negative story of place that then justifies urban renewal and forced removal. The artistic technique of the drawn scroll used as a way of describing narrative. Migration. This story reveals that the sun, which migrants reached for, is really themselves, depicted as the yellow circular halos. The sun is carried by individuals through the journey and eventually into the 15th ward, where community and culture still thrive amongst oppression. In representing this past, Black joy and optimism is juxtaposed with hardship. And they look to the works of Black vanguards, Jacob Lawrence and Aaron Douglas, for representational guidance. And the reckoning displayed in this work identifies the Black Space Manifesto principles of celebrate, catalyze, and amplify Black joy. Create circles, not lines. Black joy is symbolizing the idea of the sun, depicted as a radical act amongst the imagery of adversity, while the repetition and circling back of the sun ironically creates conceptual circles in a linear representation. Centering the lived experience. Students use design research and site analysis to explore how the policies of the past have impacted the current built environment. As they engage with residents virtually, they strive to center the lived experience in the crafting of sculptures, moving image, and renderings to express the ways that the site has been disrupted. The construct as narrative is as much an invention as it is a description, representation, signification, or emulation of a disruption of community or site. This project focused on the characteristics of the surrounding streets, buildings, open spaces, urban culture and urban forces, street boundaries in their entirety, pace, scale, character, and visual rhythm. They explored ways the spatial typologies were torn, divided, shifted, carved, split, dissected, and separated as a result of numerous federal policies. Using words as lines of an axonometric drawing to illustrate tools for separation on the site: highway, fence, sidewalk, porch, road. Those tools of urban infrastructure that overpower the site today create more of an industrial district rather than a residential community. The students explored issues of environmental justice and the impacts of the highway on the social and physical health of the community. And despite that, there's still joy. Students explored the use of moving image to represent disruption and movement, path, and the breaking of the urban scene. Abstraction of the gateway, the way it frames and creates a lens for seeing the community beyond as a void. Students explored the ways that concrete paths in the community disrupt open space, much like redlining did for community ties.
should have been downtown. The people are rising. We thought it was a lockdown. They opened the fire. Them bullets was flying. Who said it was a lockdown? Goddamn lie.
Maybe this round two. Government cinematic American drive-through. Eat the apple pie in the morning and bury the strange fruit. Then marry the strange fruit and call it the black love. So when he bleeds, I bleed the sacred riddle. Ain't no money I can make to make the cops get little. We seen him murder the indigenous, a passage middle. The Constitution of life for a bag of Skittles. So when we bleed, I load the sacred pistol. And if you need, I'll read a Sado with you. And if you rich, I pray that God forgive you. Supposed to share the garden, grow the holy in you. Maybe everything is a metaphor, one God. An African liberation is ready to take arms. They're telling you stay calm. They double barrel the shotty and stand on a graveyard and tell you to slave on.
Downtown, the people are rising. We thought it was a lockdown. They opened the fire. Them bullets was flying. Who said it was a lockdown? Goddamn lie.
Turn on your tube, dawg, look how they do us. Knee on our necks, bullets in backs, stimulus checks, strictly for blacks. History repeating, people scared to eat a chicken. Everybody going vegan, what they put in it. Look at the world we living in, they got a shook in it. You go on your jog, then your color might get you took in it. Man in the mirror, don't look away, you better look at it. Black lives matter, so what it means when they shoot at it. Generation genocide, what happened to enterprise? That the man infiltrated, Black Panther re-energized. Nothing to figure out, they trying to kill us out. If I take a nails in my fists, I'm a killer now. Just think bullshit, you gotta filter out. Are you really ready for the smoke like a Swisher House? Ready for the revolution, who ready to ride? It won't be televised, so tell me who ready to die? Know the difference from a pan and a pandemic. Just a bunch of bullshit, how we landing it. You either fall for anything or you standing it.
In that video, students physically manifested fossilization, erosion, and chipping away as a means of revealing history. In this film, the student explored a dichotomy of gateway and the harsh industrial boundaries surrounding the pioneer homes. One student team continued to use the scroll as a form of storytelling, developing a linear narrative of place. The second scroll aimed to depict scenes of everyday life in various spaces of the Pioneer Homes complex. focusing on typologies of gathering, circulation, and gateway. These images capture Black joy and life, are strung together in a narrative, walking through the homes. Disrupted within each scene is I-81 and various fences, which act as and create hardship. The disruption occurs in numerous forms depicted in shadows, barriers, and pollution, darkness juxtaposed with the sun of joy. And figures are represented with inspiration by Black artists such as Kara Walker and Aaron Douglas. Manifesting the future. So in this final project, students had the opportunity to archive the past and visualize a new future in ways that were real and surreal. Reconstruction and restoration were central to this final exercise to arrive at transformation by intervention. The main question was, how can they learn from the past to transform what is possible for the future? They were to define new narratives for edge conditions, existing buildings, and enclosed field conditions, and use the Black Space Manifesto and the words and engagement of residents from pioneer homes as inspiration for new narratives created in the community. One team decided to occupy the I-81 and create a wellness center as a way of addressing both environmental and food justice in the community. They wanted to demonstrate how occupation of the I-81 can provide an opportunity to cultivate a culture of wellness in the community, creating new opportunities and spaces for catalyzing Black joy. Where the highway imposed on the community and impacts its health negatively, those spaces could be reclaimed for food justice. Another team looked at reimagining infrastructure, transforming its use into one that centered the lived experience, uncovered a history of culture and heritage, and demonstrated new opportunities for community togetherness. Another team looked at color and its use overlaid on the urban landscape as a way of transforming place and perceptions of place and the ground plane and how it can be occupied. Another team actually looked at stitching together of the community, the physical stitching together of the community as a response to the impacts of the I-81 and the ways in which it separated the community. And this urban stitch would not only be physical stitching, but it would also be an economic, social, and cultural stitching in the community, where each stitch becomes a new place and space to inhabit. This team sought to create a community archive through the occupation processes and studies to reclaim the urban fabric. Their intervention preserves and respatializes demolished sections of the highway into built forms which serve as social condensers to the neighborhood. So the urban fabric serves as a way of telling the story through the transformation of the public space into places for joy, commercial activity, creating new vantage points for community to see themselves and to see their surrounding environment. Another team was inspired by the craftsmanship of homemade quilt racks, the idea that a handmade co-created structure can be introduced to urbanity as an extension to the domestic sphere, as a living community gallery, building off of multiple realms of craft. They saw these spaces as cultural venues, flexible spaces for shared crafting activities such as sewing, needlework, knitting, woodworking, botany. Many of the skills that residents expressed were already inherent in the community. And in the words of the student, this imagery shows spatial potential of interfering the interferer, reclaiming the margin that has been inhumanely stolen. We may not forget, simply decorate, or even hide the damage caused by the physical consequences of redlining, but the community may intervene and activate these infrastructures, moments of vacancy, to give strength and to allow the communities to blossom with the engagement of reclaiming their culture through spatial intervention. And I think for most of the students, the design of these perspectives and drawings show the potential of designing on top of existing margins so that space may be utilized by and for the community in manners to alleviate the decision of designing for, but providing for. To provide this space with a new vacancy that allows the prioritization of pedestrian circulation, to fortify the culture of the community, and to provide a space that may be activated autonomously by human intervention. And so I think this studio presented many different concepts and ideas that were explored together between residents and students. Many of the topics covered both cultural, social, economic, and environmental justice. And this panel itself, this forum, was really inspired by the ways in which students interacted with many different stakeholders, and even myself, in exploring the site and understanding, in attempts to understand the site. Many of the panelists from Syracuse in particular were very helpful in helping me navigate and understand Pioneer Homes, Ward 15, and the plans for the future. And so I thank Stephanie Pascal, Sally Santangelo, Bill Simmons, and Lanessa Owens Chaplin for their support and help and guidance in this work. And in particular to Lanessa for helping us connect with local community members who helped us really understand the dynamics in the community and helped us navigate conversations with them about future possibilities. So I want to pass it over to Baye Adolfo Wilson, who is our moderator for the evening. He is a lawyer, urban planner, a real estate developer. He owns his own real estate development firm, BAW Development, and he's also the former Deputy Mayor for Housing and Economic Development for the City of Newark. Thank you so much, Baye, for introducing our panelists and for moderating this discussion.
Well, thank you. This is, it's one of the things I miss in this environment, COVID environment that we're in. It's the capacity to give someone an applause for the presentation that they've just done. You did an excellent presentation. You weaved in the work of the students, what you and they did is excellent. I think that you really provided us with a foundation, a story, a level of detail of care. And when I first heard about the panel, Housing the Black Community, I was impressed with the ambition of it. I was like, okay, this is, how do you sort of deal with housing the Black community? But I think you guys landed it really well in terms of the teaching and the creativity and the thoughtfulness. So, pre-COVID, this would have been applause, but I just wanted to sort of acknowledge the work that you guys did on this, because it's excellent.
Thank you.
Welcome. As you mentioned, I'm Bayo Dopa Wilson. I am, I guess, sort of several things, but most importantly, I too, like folks here, grew up in public housing as well. I lived in public housing in Harlem, grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, and saw what gentrification, redlining, all that stuff is done to the Black community. And what I really appreciate about this panel and this presentation is the attempt to address it in the moment, to address it now. There's so many competing factors, when you look at what's happened in Syracuse, whether it's 81 and the sort of violence and brutality of that intersection, but also what happens in communities around the country when gentrification happens. And that too can be brutal. And so we have a panel here of folks who are homegrown as well as from New York City, who can provide you with a level of thoughtfulness and expertise about the work that they're doing to alleviate these challenges and move the community forward. So I will start off with Mr. William Simmons, who is the Executive Director of the Syracuse Housing Authority.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Wilson. Nice to be here. Good. So you would like me just to talk about?
So the way we want to roll, we're gonna give 5 to 7 minutes to everyone to talk about the work that they do, the work, how it's impactful, the work that you do. You are the Executive Director of the Syracuse Housing Authority, and what you think the community should know about your work and the challenges. This is essentially about pioneer homes. And, when I think of it, I think about the fact that there's all these people who are grandmothers and great-grandmothers who grew up in pioneer homes who are here, but also think about the people who are not here. So the people who grew up, everyone was there and they lived and they passed away and everyone was still there. And so I think about them, but also think about the opportunity for all these children who are living there now and the work that can be done to make their lives better. So as the Executive Director of Syracuse Housing Authority, I just wanted to get your opinion about how do you look at the work that the students did and its intersection with the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, good. Again, thank you for having us in this panel, and really appreciate the presentation today and the work that the students did. It was very creative, and as you mentioned during the presentation, Dr. Evo mentioned during the presentation, that it gave a different view as to how we can really approach this neighborhood from a variety of aspects. And so really did appreciate tonight's presentation. I've been at the Syracuse Housing Authority for the past 13 years. And, it's been a time when, an accelerated time when HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, really started to divest in public housing and was looking to get out from under the public housing business. And so I came to the Housing Authority in 2007. And it was at a time when really, I think many people thought that, they brought me in to be the executive director to kind of turn out the lights. When I grew up in public housing in the Bronx, and what's called Sonia Sotomayor now, but it used to be Bronxdale. And, like many of you may remember, back in those days, you had cops on foot patrol. You had, neighbors very much engaged in a lot of residential activities for young people. And it was, a great sense of community and opportunity. But over the years, past 10, 15 years, there had been that slow divestment in public housing. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development wanted housing authorities to operate more like private sector landlords, and it became less about community and social work and more about private sector and making sure that you had your apartments leased up to 97% and make sure you were collecting rent at 95%, all of the measures that you would judge private sector landlords on. While at the same time, there's constant erosion of the dollars that it took to operate public housing from a capital standpoint and also from an operational standpoint. And so you saw that erosion in Syracuse as well as what you may have seen in throughout the country. And so, but the one thing that HUD really wanted housing authorities to do was become affordable housing developers in neighborhoods if those opportunities exist. And so, one of the advantages of being in Syracuse was that we have a pretty large housing authority. It's a medium-sized housing authority nationally, but pretty large per capita for a city the size of Syracuse. And so what that meant was we, have a lot of developments, we have a lot of staffing and the opportunity, and there was even some vacant lands that we own as an opportunity to get into the business of developing affordable housing in Syracuse. And so we were able to do some of that over the past 13 years. We were able to rehab the Leonard buildings, that's 48 units of properties that were on the HUD auction. We built the Homes of Syracuse, 50 units of 9% tax credit program was designed for rent to own. We built the Leonard buildings, 50 units of housing that was supportive housing for reentry population. And so we've really kind of stepped our toes into creating new affordable housing in the city of Syracuse, a city that was in sorely need of good quality housing for affordable families. And then then we really had an opportunity to look at Pioneer Homes a little differently. We knew that what we were doing there was not going to be sustainable. And with the opportunity with I-81 looking at New York State trying to decide what they was going to do with I-81, we kind of looked at it as an opportunity to do something different in the neighborhood and a little bit more transformative. As a result, back in 2016, we commissioned a study by Gilmore King, some developers out of Washington, D.C. As a result of that study and charrettes with a number of the neighbors, we had come up with a plan that pretty much wanted to reconnect the streets, do mixed income housing and commercial, and have more commercial mixed use housing, mixed income housing and mixed use housing in that neighborhood. That was back in 2016. And we were really very much engaged with the eminent decision for I-81 that, when I say eminent, I've been here for 13 years and we've been working on I-81 for the past 10. So, but, I think we're getting very, very close to a decision. But again, we pretty much came up with this plan, and with the new mayor in, he wanted to enhance the plan that we had come up with, which was affordable housing and mixed use neighborhood, and include more of a capital improvement, a humanistic improvement for families, investing in families as well as infrastructure in the neighborhood and streets and housing, and as well as improving the neighborhood schools and the wellness component. So it was a more holistic approach in working with Blueprint 15. And we're just pretty much at that stage now where we brought on a developer and are working with, attempting to work through HUD's choice neighborhood planning grants and implementation grants to transform the neighborhood.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things I wanted to mention before we move forward on this, though, is some of the students' work. So they talked about some interventions that were quick and timely. Did you see anything in there that you really thought could be helpful in the context of, you mentioned that you had been working on I-81 for 11 years. And I'm assuming a lot of that had to do with the previous administration. Since you started your plan in 2016, there wasn't much movement in HUD over the last 4 years. And so now there's a new administration. What are you have you sort of begun to think about ways that you can implement those plans? And if there's any way that the classroom, the classes work can be helpful in that?
Well, I thought some of the designs that and thought process that we saw today were very, very informative. So for instance, the Syracuse Housing Authority was supportive of the community grid approach and tearing down the overpass I-81. And so through a number of studies and community meetings, New York State has decided that the community grid option is the preferred option, and they sent that recommendation on to the Federal Highway Department. And so, but there was always that possibility, and may still be, that they rebuild the highway as it is today. And so what could be done underneath I-81 differently than what is structured? And I saw some very creative things in today's presentation that I thought was very meaningful and helpful. Then there was even the possibility of not utilizing I-81, but what could you use? How could that overpass, even if it remained, become good community space, even if the cars weren't driving above and you didn't really physically tear down I-81? So I thought some of those ideas were good and creative, and I think would be helpful going forward.
That's excellent. In terms of neighborhood, this is a neighborhood process and neighborhood project. And Stephanie Pascal, the director of neighborhood advancement for the Allen Family Foundation, is really a space where she's an expert at. So I want to ask her to jump in and talk about the work that she's doing and the students' work as well.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me here tonight and for getting to witness that presentation and that work. It's incredibly powerful and creative, and just, I don't know why I keep getting amazed at the depth of understanding and abilities of students, but that was just truly special. And I can't wait I want to watch it again, and I want to do it again and really soak it in. I am the director of neighborhood advancement, as mentioned, with the Allen Family Foundation, and I've only been here for a little less than a year, but most of my career has been in affordable housing development through nonprofit work and through municipal government. And most recently, I was the commissioner for neighborhood and business development for the city of Syracuse. And while the foundation's mission is to build strong families and vibrant neighborhoods in central New York, on the vibrant neighborhood side, we're charged with trying to empower the community organizations and residents to transform their neighborhoods into safe, healthy, and vibrant places where families thrive, and ensure that each person has access to clean, stable, and affordable housing, as well as community-based cultural experiences that build community. So that sort of grounds sort of how we approach this work. And as Bill mentioned, there's a number of sort of projects and activities that we're involved with, but I assume you want me to speak mostly to how it relates to this design work today in the East Adams neighborhood, and particularly concentrated in the Pioneer Homes community. And as Bill mentioned, thinking about this sort of holistic approach, for years, I've been doing this kind of work for about 20 years. And while it can be very frustrating when we all seem to, work really hard, but don't yield positive results, and or don't seem to have the impact with these well-intentioned policies or well-intentioned ideas. And what was attractive about 3 years ago, some of us members of this very group started talking about how can we approach this a little differently, rather than just looking at sometimes physical improvement, for example, like replacing housing is the goal. And, what we know is, it takes sort of, just a much more comprehensive approach to truly disrupting, the cycle of poverty and creating durable, deep bonding pathways to prosperity or to building wealth. So one of the ways that we looked at, a project called Purpose-Built Communities that started about 25 years ago in the Atlanta area. And in the city of Atlanta, there's a neighborhood called East Lake. That was the first purpose-built community. And they sort of looked at what are the components or the pillars that could drive true transformation and create this sort of bold vision and bring it to reality. And those components, as Bill touched upon, were, truly affordable, high quality, mixed income housing is a key tenet, as well as cradle to college educational programming that is best in class and that is tested and true. And the third component is health and wellness, and whatever that means for a particular community. And each community that might be very different, from, access to clinical services, to physical health and wellness, to, having access to affordable and healthy fruits and vegetables. So, and there's much more, mental health and wellness and all kinds of components. So we sort of started taking residents right from the neighborhood to come look at this purpose-built stuff. Is this too good to be true? What have they done in other communities, and how could this work? And really talking to people about in the community what they'd like to see for their neighborhood. And while we're just getting started on the physical sort of master planning process, what we've tried to show with our investments is that we need this to be sustainable. We need this to be resident-led and driven. We need to build the power and the information that residents hold and bring their vision, not just we bring their vision to life, but really and have them be part of that journey and part of the implementation and participate in any of the wealth building that results in a lot of the strategies and things that even were shared today. So to get what inspired me or really spoke to me with the presentations, and by the way, I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff in more detail, but I'm looking at the clock and trying to keep to my time. What really inspired me about the quote, and it's in many fashions, I've heard it, but I loved how it was phrased: to learn from the past to transform the future, and how each of those strategies or proposals that were shown today incorporated those very elements of preserving, protecting, sharing stories of the past, making sure we don't forget, and how we use those opportunities to truly transform the future. So there was no particular one that I can point to that I would say, oh, we could implement that maybe tomorrow. But I thought there were just interesting elements and really compelling elements of each one that are just really worth exploring and figuring out how we can hopefully on the short term implement some things, but really in the long-term vision and the long-term sort of braiding of this work, how we make sure we don't lose the elements that were discussed. And I just thought it was incredibly creative, particularly the preserving a section of the highway where it looked like there were vignettes or stories above. It was hard for me to see exactly the detail, but I thought that was just beautiful and really an interesting way to, again, preserve the past and, as we look to transform the future. And the other part, Bill mentioned, we're in this sort of planning phase, right? We still don't know, residents are feeling uncertain and they're feeling what's going to happen. When am I going to get kicked out of this neighborhood? Am I going to be welcomed back? And I think a key component to what we're trying to do, again, is really build that network and build that engagement around, no, we want you to know every second of every step of the way exactly where this project is moving forward. And if we, and to really be part of a true decision maker in what lies ahead. So I guess I'll leave it with that. And I don't know if you wanted me to comment further.
Well, what we're going to do, we got some comments later on, but that was excellent because I think that you did have the image in terms of the visual image of the space that you enjoyed. But what I want to do is get everyone through, and then we can have time for a conversation. So I'm going to skip to Stephanie Pascal, who is the Director of Neighborhood Advancement. No, not Stephanie, Sally Santiago, who is Executive Director of C&Y Fair Housing.
Hello, good evening. And I'm just at Sally Santangelo, and I'm with C&Y Fair Housing. We're a small nonprofit located in Syracuse and providing fair housing services across 15 counties of central and upstate New York. And we work to investigate housing discrimination and to promote housing opportunity. We do that by investigating fair housing complaints and providing legal representation, and then also through policy advocacy and research and technical assistance regarding housing, barriers to housing choice. We most recently completed a fair housing assessment for the city of Syracuse and Onondaga County. That's part of their obligation to HUD to affirmatively further fair housing, whatever that obligation means these days. But and I wanted to just kind of, talk a little bit about, some of what we look at as an organization around this redevelopment and this neighborhood. I want to first say that, we tend to focus on this neighborhood, I think oftentimes in terms of policy, in terms of data, and in terms of, what is the housing conditions? What are the issues there? So to see this work of these students and to see this neighborhood and this community that presented, to see the art of this community was really quite remarkable. And I think something we don't, think about enough as a community in Central New York, that we don't focus on that. We don't see that joy. And I know that our organization, we tend to hear, we are a complaint organization. We get complaints all the time from people, whether they live in from Pioneer Homes or anywhere in Central or upstate New York. So we tend to hear the worst of things. So it's really nice to think about the neighborhood fabric there in a different way, and to see that presented in such a beautiful and inspiring way by the students. And I think that has to be really like the center of this, how we think about this project moving forward. Because I think we talk about creating a mixed income neighborhood and creating mixed use neighborhood. And it raises a lot of questions, of course, right? So questions about how will displacement be handled, whether that's temporary displacement or, whether people will be able to return. And then the question of, is that still their neighborhood, right? Is it still people's neighborhood once it's been redeveloped into this mixed income and mixed use neighborhood? We have in Central New York and in Syracuse, some of the worst concentrated poverty in the country. And, there's concerns that, and while there's certainly a goal we want to reduce those concentrations of poverty, or at least that's always been the goal for, I think as a fair housing advocate, that's always been a goal. But what does that really mean for individuals in terms of how does that disrupt the neighborhood that they live in? And I think that the idea of how you balance improving housing quality and improving how opportunity to all of those things that, education and health and wellness, all those goals that Stephanie talked about. How do you balance that with the disruption that redevelopment inevitably causes? And redevelopment inevitably causes disruption, right? It has to, right? And so I think that reconciling that is, I think, really important, and certainly what we're looking at, certainly from a more legal perspective, in terms of, what choices people have, what kinds of, will there be barriers to people returning? Will there be limits on what people's options are? Are people just going to be given vouchers, in the meantime, and handed a voucher to be able to go move that will just further concentrate them or put them in another high poverty neighborhood in a different part of the city? Are all kind of the questions that we look at as an organization, I think, moving forward. The question of who gets to determine, what a neighborhood should be, and is, I think, central, I think, to this discussion. And it's, I noticed in one of the collages, there was a newspaper headline that I thought was really fitting. it said Hughes, which was a elected official back in the, I think the urban renewal, time of urban renewal. It says Hughes seeks state aid for 15th Ward housing. And I mean, you could rewrite that, rename the elected official. And, this is really one of the issues is we're often so constrained to by the funding for these projects, right? So we have, just so many limits on what can be done, and it really kind of changes and defines, I think, what we can do, often because these projects are, state funded, federal funded. I have make sure looking at my notes, make sure I covered everything I wanted to mention. So, I think, and I think it's really important to kind of recognize that, people face really limited housing choices in many ways in our community. They're still limited oftentimes by discriminatory practices. They're limited by the availability of quality affordable housing. We have a shortage of quality affordable housing in our community. And I think when we talk about redevelopment, that has to also be, an important recognition of again, improving housing opportunity within those constraints. I'll stop there.
No, that was great. Thank you. One of the things I want to touch on, a comment you made about redevelopment that I think is interesting, because the presentation sort of touched on it too, was this notion of sort of Black joy, Black kid joy, Black joy, and just sort of and what I felt like the students did a great job in is trying to depict that. I think the issue and one of the challenges around redevelopment and developing communities is what are the experiences of Black people who live in those in pioneer homes today? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they're loving? Are they considerate? What are the experiences there? And if they had a voucher, what would they do with it? Because I think that there's some, because one of the things, and I think it's our next speaker in terms of talks about it in context of what does issues around reparations, around entitlement, what does all that look like in the context if you've been displaced and marginalized for so long and you've been in a community that has a highway next to it that you grew up living next to, and then you had a plan that's been going on for 20 years, how much faith or hope that you actually believe that things are going to change? And so do you wait for the change or you make a decision to leave now? And so I think that the work that Vanessa does is excellent. And she's a project counsel for the New York Civil Liberties Union, Central New York chapter. But I think that I'm thinking about it in the broader context, because unfortunately, what happened with Pioneer Homes is really replicated all over the United States. So Vanessa, can you come in?
Hi, yeah, thank you for that introduction. So yeah, my name is Vanessa Chaplin. I work for the ACLU of New York. We have an office in New York City, and then we have 8 chapter offices across the state, and I work in the Central New York office. Our focus and our mission at the NYCLU is civil liberties, civil rights, and that kind of expands to all different avenues. And we kind of got involved in this infrastructure project at its original build. We've seen how the original build impacted this community and opened a chapter within months of that year. So we have a long history with this I-81 viaduct. And we got involved as soon as we could when we heard about this transformation actually coming into real play. We know that it's been around, like Bill said, for like 13 years. They've been talking about actually getting rid of the highway, but now that it's kind of actually happening, we got involved. And I think your students really hit it on the head with what the issues are. And before I even get into that, I just kind of want to, I just kind of have to say this, that a lot of times we talk about this community, what these people need, as if they're monolithic. They're all one big blob of people. And it's really troublesome to me. These are people, these are grandmothers, grandfathers, sisters, brothers, uncles, nephews, nieces, cousins. And to talk about this community in a way in which they need hand-holding or guidance. You probably will never hear that kind of discussion about a community in the suburbs, right? You'll never go into a suburban community and say, this community is too white, too middle class. We need to transform this community. It needs to be a mixed income community, right? And so why do we go into communities that are working class and say, we have to transform this community. This community needs our help. We need to create mixed income housing. And I would love to see that same energy in some of these very segregated suburban areas and suburban communities. And I would love to see how that would go over in a town hall meeting with majority white folks who consider themselves middle class and say, we're going to transform your neighborhood because it's just not good enough, right? It's just not meeting the markers that we think you should meet. So I just wanted to say that. I didn't plan to say that, but I just had to put that out there. I was moved by your students' presentation, and I really think it put the human side of it in there. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that, elevate what their artwork was saying to me. But as far as the issues that we've kind of were able to enumerate, this project is huge, but the ones that we were able to kind of focus on were racial justice. And basically that means making sure that during the construction project, the folks who were impacted at the original build and the folks who are going to be impacted now are adequately taken care of. What are their needs as far as the immediate project? Not long-term, we're talking about right now. What are their needs and how do we meet those needs? And elevating the voice of that community, because we don't have to be shy. It's a Black community, we can say that, right? We don't have to tippy-toe around who we're talking about and how historically state actors have treated Black communities. And so elevating that to say, you need to do more in this community than you would do in any other community, because there's a really bad history here that happened not too long ago. Folks are still alive from the original build, and they can tell you and they can talk about the impact of the original build had on their personal lives. And so we have to address that. And we're trying to push the DOT to address that. We're also pushing for restorative justice, meaning we know during that time period, not just the construction of ID1, but also with urban renewal, as you pointed out in the beginning of the discussion, the Black community in Syracuse lost 101 acres of land. We know that, right? The US Civil Rights DOJ has they did their research and they tell us that. And so restorative justice, what are we gonna do to allow the Black community that is currently here obtain some land? And so we're asking them, when the viaduct does come down, to reserve some of that land in a land trust for the Black community. That's what we're looking at as restorative justice. And then the other piece is environmental justice. And what is this highway? What has it done to this community? What has it done to the soil? What has it done to the air? What has it done to their houses? We often think about lead as something that's inside your walls, it's not inside your paint, but it's also in the air, right? And it sticks on your clothes. And when you go home and you go to bed, it's now on your bed, right? So these folks are living and breathing in toxic areas. And we know Syracuse is not unique. And so I don't want to paint a picture like Syracuse is unique. We have Black communities and brown communities living in the most polluted zip codes in our country. And so what are we going to do about that, right? And we don't mean put some nice, cute dirt over it and we'll deal with it in 7 years, or paint over the wall that has the lead. We mean full remediation, right? We want it gone. What else do we talk about? Economic justice. And so one of the things that we're pushing the Department of Transportation to do is the land trust would be one way to get economic justice, because we're talking about building equity in the way that they see fit. I thought it was really important to say, we're not advocating for affordable housing as a result of this. We're not advocating for inclusionary zoning as a result of this. We're advocating to return the land so they can decide how they want to build equity on their land, right? And so that was really important. And I think, Stephanie might have mentioned this, like people being able to build equity and like how important that is in the community. And the other piece of economic justice is making sure that people who are employed at the job, who can be employed around this construction project, right? Making sure folks get employment. And we're doing that in numerous ways. And so we started this postcard campaign a while back where we're in the community canvassing, knocking on doors, saying, what are your concerns? What are your issues? Going directly to them. Then we're also we were until COVID, holding weekly workshops to talk to community members in their neighborhood to figure out what they want, what they need. And after about 2 years of meetings, we thought we had enough to write a report, which will be out next week. I've been saying that for a couple months, but it really will be out next week. And we created a report, and we've written comments to the DOT, trying to hold them accountable, and working with folks that are on this panel today and just trying to elevate their voice in this conversation. And so I think for me, our work is really centered around elevating the community's work the best that we can, but also being very clear that we don't speak for everyone. We can only speak to the folks that we actually talk to. And we can hear what they want. And if what they want doesn't match what we think they should want, that doesn't mean we disengage. I mean, we have talked to several people in that community who are saying they don't want the viaduct to come down. And I can talk to them for 45 minutes about how it's bad for their health and it's bad for the environment. They want it there. So I also want to elevate their voice and say, well, fill out this comment card and let the DOT know this is what you want. And so I think it's really centering their voices and not having this, and I'm going to say it, white savior attitude where you know what's best and you can come in this community and transform it into something that's going to be beneficial for everyone. Because transformation often means displacement. Mixed use income often means displacement. And I don't think anyone should be willing to sacrifice one family for the better good of the entire neighborhood when we have absolutely no statistics that prove that. There's no data that supports this kind of idea that this is going to elevate an entire community. And I'm at my time.
Well, that was excellent. We have two areas that we are addressing. We have some policy considerations as well as some design considerations. And I want to make sure that we sort of touch on both, that we don't leave it because as a lot of you mentioned, the people who live in pioneer homes, the people who live in the community, their participation, their voice is important. The access, their families' lives, their capacity to work. But there's also issues around sort of the current environment, the health issues. How do you make the neighborhood healthier now? How do you make it design-wise? How do you improve it? So I want us to make sure that and this sort of feedback that you're about to get from our two New York City critics or commentators, that we sort of talk about both the policy considerations, but also design. So we're going to start with Rasmia Kermani Fry, who is an independent consultant on public housing. And I would like her to start, and then I want Justin Moore to jump in, who also is a founder of Urban Patch.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Rasmia, or Raz, if that's easier. And thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Lanessa, I'm going to probably build on a lot of what you said. I really appreciate everything you said. Let me first say that what I most appreciated, and Ifeoma, you did a beautiful job presenting, and all of the students' work. What I appreciated and what's been said is how much the work centered residents and centered Blackness, but centered residents as experts, the historians, the artists, the co-creators of the community, which they are, and communities are. So before I dive in, just 2 minutes about me, so I'm not like a floating random person. Again, my name is Rasmia. I live in Brooklyn, New York. Been in New York for, oh my goodness, 25 years. I am an independent consultant. That is very recent. Prior to doing that work, or prior, I should say, I spent about a decade in Brownsville, Brooklyn, running a community-based organization. And actually, Justin and I are friends and know each other, and sit on the board of an incredible organization in Brownsville called the Youth Design Center, which I have to mention, of course. And after being in Brownsville for that long, and I had been a community organizer long before that, I kind of did the unthinkable to most people in my life, which is that I went and worked at the New York City Housing Authority. And before working at the Housing Authority, I sought the approval of many, many Brownsville residents, honestly, as never having worked in government. And had they said no, don't go work there, I would not have. They overwhelmingly said yes. I was there for about 5 years. I ran the Office of Public-Private Partnerships at the Housing Authority. And while I was there, I also created an independent nonprofit organization called the Fund for Public Housing, which is really NYCHA's Innovation Escape Hatch. It still exists. So that's a little bit about me, so you know kind of where I'm coming from. So I'm going to comment on some things that many of you have touched on. I may also talk a little bit about the national kind of public housing world and what might be possible. I mean, got to be radically optimistic. So like what might be possible now? And so let me start by just giving a little bit of context for folks that, you know, there are over 4 million people live in public housing and subsidized housing in the United States. As a country, there's a $75 billion repair backlog, 40 billion of which is New York City Housing Authority backlog, just to give you just some perspective. And, you know, public housing is at an existential crisis. There have been a term that I've often heard, and Justin has probably heard this in New York too, is that it's teetering on this like demolition by neglect. That really is about decades of racial oppression, systemic racism, white supremacy, disinvestment. I mean, to Lanessa's point, like, let's call things what they are. That does not mean that there is not opportunity to change that, but it will take incredible intentionality and not goodwill. I think it is really important to say, and this follows Ifeoma's emphasis on narrative, that in the country, we don't value public housing the way we value other systems with the word public in front of it. And I think that's an important narrative that is out there. So, right, and often what I say is like, listen, even if you like hate kids, people tend to agree that like a good public education system is a good thing. Good for cities, certainly for us New Yorkers, we love to hate on our public transportation, but that's because we depend on it. Public libraries, public art. We value these systems with the word public in front of it. We do not value public housing the same way. Why is that? I would put forth that part of the reason why we don't value public housing the same way we value other systems is because we collectively don't value public housing residents, because there is a narrative out there about who lives in public housing. Certainly in New York City, whether or not New Yorkers, like good liberal New Yorkers, there is this narrative about who lives in public housing. And it is certainly those brown and Black people over there who perhaps the narrative is that they are undeserving of what they are receiving, the undeserving poor. I'm not saying everyone, but I think it is really important that if we are talking about transformation, that we confront these narratives that are out there. And the narrative issue, I think, really is an issue of equity. So when a narrative is rooted and created in community, by community, and then it is amplified, that narrative is amplified, it is more equitable, period. And that includes identifying, and communities identifying credible messengers. Who are those messengers? It is not who other people deem to be messengers. That is, I think, is incredibly important. And I know I'm going to talk over my time, so I will move quickly to the next point, which is really in the Black Space Manifesto, move at the speed of trust and learn from the past to build the future. So let's just take a moment and really talk about kind of the trust deficit that that exists between systems and people who are at the effect of systems. That is just a reality, right? There is an enormous trust deficit. It doesn't, again, mean that it can't be repaired, but it does mean that it has to be repaired with intentionality and not merely goodwill. And this kind of sea of distrust is again, and I'm going to keep saying it again because I think it's important, is fortified by decades and decades of systemic oppression, racism, neglect, disinvestment, a lack of transparency, resident engagement that doesn't center resident self-determination, which is different. Resident self-determination is different from resident engagement. Lacks continuous feedback loops, and really, really is in desperate need of a process of authentic co-creation and dialogue. And I think it's really hard, nearly impossible, to build an equitable kind of housing policy platform if this relationship doesn't change. And so that's where we need to start. And so, and again, it doesn't mean that I don't think it's possible to change. And so to echo some of what, or I guess it's a cousin of what Lanessa was talking about, is on a national level, so not just in Syracuse, not just in New York City, everywhere, in tribal communities, everywhere, there needs to be some kind of process, I call it a National Commission to Restore Trust, that is embedded as part of a broader reparations process in the way that Lanessa has described. But what would a National Commission to Restore Trust do? It really is this deliberate process to restore trust among public housing residents, public housing authorities, other residents of subsidized housing landlords, and HUD. And because this is a national dialogue, stakeholders from all areas really need to be involved. And these would actually be hearings where residents can share stories of harm directly. And then those harms could be acknowledged and a larger reparations process exists. Okay, I'm gonna move, there's a lot there, I know, and feel free to come at me. I wanna say one more thing, which is that I think in the design process, and I know Justin will talk about design, which is why I'm leaving it alone mostly. In the design process and in the decision-making process, narrative, all of the things I've talked about, I really think that it's incredibly important, and I'll use this word again, that residents are central, are the actors in decision-making and against self-determination, so that it's mandated that all redevelopment processes must include residents as central decision makers throughout, from feasibility to developer selection to design process. And if you are at all curious about what perhaps another country has done to do this, I highly recommend this. I have nothing to do with this. I did not write it. I don't have friends who wrote it. It's just excellent. It's called Public Housing Revolution, and it is about how London social housing changed their design and redevelopment decision-making in order to center resident self-determination. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to do justice a little bit more justice in terms of who he is. Yeah, he wears many hats, but he's an adjunct associate professor Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, as well as founder of Urban Patch.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And this has been a great conversation, kind of a long arc of understanding all of the different injustices that we've seen for hundreds of years, for centuries, for generations, when it comes to Black people and their communities, and especially around the issue of housing. I really want to build on so many things that have already come up, whether it's participation and empowerment, or conversations about reparations and ownership and control, and especially to build on all of the great work that we saw shared from the students. As I'm here to sort of help ground this in some design conversations, I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to talk about design, which is hard to do without visuals. And I want to talk about Black people in space, in American space, in communities. And I'm going to talk about the subjectivity of that. It's actually come up already, like who lives in a Black community. And so this is a different sort of image, subjectivity of Black people I want to share. This is an image of Madam C.J. Walker in Indianapolis in the early 1900s in her electric vehicle. For those of you who may not know, Madam Walker was born into poverty and was America's first self-made woman millionaire. She was also Black. And Madam Walker grew her success and her business in a community in Indianapolis, where I'm from originally, around Indiana Avenue. And this is an image of Indiana Avenue, one of the many Black centers in the US that was vibrant, intact, had, due to unfortunate issues of segregation and discrimination, kind of a concentration of Black businesses and homes and organizations that were vibrant, and even created things like this. This is the Madam Walker building. This is a building built for the Madam Walker Company. It had a theater, a manufacturing company, a school, a ballroom, offices, all sorts of things, like hybrid design, all packed into this triangle. But fast forward to today, we see new development coming in. This issue has come up already in this conversation. So development for sites, and this was a proposal to develop on land right next to that Walker Theater. And you can see it's this sort of developer special, and really not reflecting concerns of the community. And so it's already been introduced, this idea of what are the different ways that we talk about how development happens, how do we plan it, how do we envision it, and bringing in other considerations like trust, like how to center lived experience, thinking about subjectivity. But an important one is definitely to reckon with the past to build the future. And so if we take something like this important Black space, the Walker Building, is sort of one element, we have to understand that the Walker Building existed in a community, right? In a Black community. So there was a fabric here that had different types of conditions that Black people existed in space. And we have to understand this kind of context. And so this is a story that's familiar to many Black communities across the US and frankly, the world. So you see that little triangle on the image, that was the Walker Building, and you see an intact neighborhood. And what happened to this neighborhood over time was everything that we all know, the erasure, the demolition, the sort of expansion of things like universities to take over space that had been formerly Black space, taking over spaces like what was once my grandfather's home on 427 Agnes Street, which is now in the footprint of IUPUI's Kavanaugh Hall. And so we come together today to this sort of context where this harm, erasure has occurred, and we have to acknowledge who did that, how did it happen, and to know that these sort of landscapes are also a part of Black space, and that they're landscapes that Black people have consistently been in opposition to. These are images from students protesting the expansion of that university And so we're here in the context of a university and to understand the power of our institutions in this work. And so if we talk about planning with and designing with and empowerment, decision-making, who gets to be a part of that, we have to sort of ask some questions. So when a development comes into a community with all the, the promises, oh, it's going to be mixed income, it's going to generate more people to make the neighborhood vibrant, we have to really ask, well, who was involved in making those decisions? And we have to acknowledge that we're doing it wrong again, right? Over and over and over again. And we also have to acknowledge that our Black communities deserve better. And so when we talk about manifesting the future, and this is some of the work that the students have already started doing, kind of creating these new spaces of imagination that do include Black people at the forefront, we have to think about the moment that we've been in for a long time, but also the moment that we're in now. This is an image from the Black Lives Matter protests that were occurring over the summer following the killing of George Floyd, that frankly has produced a lot of different things, like the space and the conversation that we're having right now at Syracuse University. And these are a group of artists and activists working to reclaim Indiana Avenue. And they planted one of the many Black Lives Matter murals in front of that proposed development site that people were protesting against, and doing the mark making work through design, through expression, through Black power and agency to say that Black lives matter, but also Black spaces matter. And so a group of us designers brought in our kind of work and agency to reimagine and create alternative visions for the work that happens in this space, that was really focused and centered on not only that one site, but to acknowledge that there was an entire community here, not just one building, but an entire community that needs to be sort of reconstructed and knitted together through forms of connectivity and through the creation of multiple types and scales of Black spaces. And this recovery of Black spaces is a multi-scalar project that acknowledges the harm and the erasure that was done, and creates sort of new spaces of care and new environments that are greener and sustainable, but providing for spaces for activity for people, and even connection to the water, which has now become sort of a gentrification euphoria. And so that was the work of finding out what people wanted. They wanted space for Black businesses, spaces to express culture. There's Ifeoma here in the photo. Spaces for education. This is an image from Youth Design Center made in Brownsville. Just spaces for people to be in public space. And so this idea of kind of bringing back together all these different programs to create an alternative vision was work that as designers we were doing to counter the sort of the developer-driven vision, the white man's kind of approach to solving the problem here, to introduce other ideas and other approaches that bring a different kind of fabric to this neighborhood. And so my last image here is to say, okay, this is great. These are designers doing work. Well, design has power. By working with the local activists, young and old, all different generations, we were able to stop that development project. This is a letter from November 20th, which is today, from the developer writing to the city planning department, withdrawing their application for that horrible development. So design does matter and can be a form of empowerment. Thank you.
We have about 15 more minutes to talk. And I want to just, there's a couple things that sort of bothered me about this, not bothered, but sort of I feel challenging about this presentation. And one is the amount of time that has gone on where nothing seems to have changed. You know, maybe I'm reading the presentations wrong, maybe I'm not getting them correctly, but it just feels like there's been a lack of momentum. There's been a lack of momentum around the removing of the highway, if that's the ultimate goal. And I also feel, and it's something Vanessa mentioned earlier, that there's a lack of sort of, Black community is not monolithic, but there's also a lot of conservative Black voices in Black communities who don't want affordable housing, who don't want low-income housing, who want to live in mixed-income community or want to leave. And so I feel like I want to open this up, but I felt like the students provided us an opportunity to come up with some solutions that we could think about in the short term. And I believe in movements. I believe in organization. I believe in organizing. And so I feel that there was a lot of good ideas in the presentations, and I don't want us to sort of just leave all of those ideas where they're at. I want us to figure out ways that we can think about implementing them and providing a support system for the folks that are in Syracuse to implement them. So I want to sort of throw out, what do people feel are important policy considerations or ways to really address what needs to happen to address, what are people not talking about in the context of what needs to be addressed to remove the highway?
Sorry, could you restate the question? So what aren't people talking about? Like what?
I mean, it's been there. Is it the political power? Is it the lack of local capacity? Are people selling folks out? Is it not the political will? Or are people just comfortable with the access? Are people comfortable with being able to get in and off the highway and feel like the highway through the middle of Syracuse is efficient?
I think that you're asking a really charged question.
That's
because there's so much division over what should happen to this highway. As you can imagine, it crosses race and color lines quite evenly, right? So you have the more suburban, predominantly white communities who want to see the highway remain there. It grants them easy access to their jobs, easy access to their education, and then they can just drive right off and go back home to their cozy suburbs with a real undertone of racism that no one wants to talk about out loud, right? It's like, we don't want to drive through the city. That just so happened to be predominantly Black, right? We don't want to have to stop at a stop sign. We might get robbed at a stop sign. Even though the crime rate there is no different than anywhere else in our county. So there's I think there's a real division of what should happen to the highway. And there's some, I would say really, heavily funded folks who want to see the highway there that are doing a good job at campaigning around saving I-81. But on the flip side, there's also some real economic incentives to remove the highway. So you have local developers, you have local firms. The city has an invested interest because obviously if they can convince the state to tear the highway down, they're going to have 18 acres of land then that's now tax revenue for the city. So there's a lot of economic interest. From where we stand as an organization, we're not in a rush to get the highway down. For us, it's not about get the highway down, keep it up. We want it done right. And so there's a lot of pressure, even on NYCLU, to stop advocating so hard for things we think we'll never get because we're slowing the process down. And we're perfectly okay with slowing the process down if that means the community has a better outcome. And so I think that the very charged question that you're asking, and luckily I think everyone here on this panel locally is all on the same line of that divisiveness, is that there are a lot of people who don't want that viaduct down because it's really a matter of convenience for them. And now with COVID-19, it further complicates. Where's the funding going to come from? And should we just patch and repair and revisit this idea in another decade?
And the reason I mention that is because the interventions that the students designed are important in the context of those conversations. So if you're saying that the reason why the highway hasn't been removed is because of the reason it was put there. It was put there so it would be easy to get in and out of the suburbs, and it's still easy to get in and out of the suburbs. So the people who controlled it 60 years ago, 70 years ago, are the same people who are controlling it today. But at the same time, we're still living there. It still runs through pioneer homes. People are raising their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandchildren are probably at this point, maybe even great at this point, people are living and dying. So what happens in that context now? While we develop the momentum and the movement to change it, and as you mentioned, to do it right.
So I think, Vanessa mentioned the suburban drivers who don't want to be slowed down or inconvenienced, when the actually facts show, right, that it wouldn't actually slow things down very much at all. In fact, at certain times of the day, it's faster if we remove the highway to get to your job at the university or the hospitals. So I think part of it is, and I'm saying this as a, person who has spent most of her life in the suburbs of Syracuse, living in the suburbs of Syracuse, who grew up in the suburbs, and that the image that I think, as that suburban residents are given of this neighborhood, and the image of that our policymakers and those well-funded entities that don't want to, that want to see the highway stay there, the image, what they're presented is not what these students saw in that community. And that's why I think this work, is so important, right? And why maybe we do need to start working to think about how we can change and incorporate that art and joy in how we see that neighborhood, because we're not seeing that. I think so many of people are not presented with that vision, that image of the community, of the Black community in Syracuse.
Because one of the things that was also just mentioned was that there's an economic incentive to have 18 acres of land in the middle of the town that becomes arrendable, that's prime real estate. I mean, one of the challenges, and one of the reasons why gentrification happens so much for Black communities, because oftentimes they're the closest one to all of the commerce, to all of the public transportation. And so when people get over their Blackness, they're like, oh, I can live here because it's 5 minutes to work, or it's 5 minutes to school, or the hospital's down the street. And so the transition takes place relatively quickly, because also our experiences there are not the same as white folks' experience in these Black communities. And so there's a challenge there. But I think the other portion of it is, if there's so much pressure to keep it, then what are people doing to, what are local organizations, how can they change the trajectory of it? How do they change it? And the reason why I keep going back to the designs, because I think that one of the things that was really important, the quilt project was something that struck me, because it reminded me, my grandmother made quilts, but it also reminded me of the beauty of it and the continuous telling of the story. I mean, the challenges that Black communities have dealt with, they haven't changed. I mean, we've changed in the context of what we've been struggling with, but the level of oppression and systematic has been there consistently. And so the notion that you're going to have to do something, we're going to still have to figure out ways to live in a community that's the healthiest and best for us. And so having these interventions that happen along the way, I think, are important. And I think that the students really did that in multiple ways. So I do think that, and I think Justin touched on it before, that this is really critical to sort of look at those interventions because of their beauty and the joy that they bring.
So I just want to bring up, and thank you guys, this has really been a fantastic discussion. I want to bring up one topic, which is the topic of gentrification and the ways in which people perceive the plans of Blueprint 15 to redevelop pioneer homes, and how some are fearful that this could ignite displacement. And so one question we have in the chat, in the Q&A, is if we could talk about the number of current Syracuse public housing residents that will be displaced by Blueprint 15 and are unlikely to ever return to the newly developed area.
Well, Bill could certainly speak to the numbers of the housing in the area that are part of the planning geographic focus. I hope every single family remains in the area. I hope when we talked about that disruption and that any redevelopment causes disruption, I hope that we cause as little disruption as possible, as you know, some of that housing is redeveloped. But my understanding and our goal is not to mix the income with, you know, kicking out 300 families so that we can have a mix of 700, you know, affordable units and 300 market rate units, but rather to add into, you know, add that level of opportunity in the footprint so that residents that do want to own a home, that we build new homes in the area if home ownership is something that families are interested in. And, you know, recent conversations with residents, there's a lot of people interested in owning their own home. We want to provide those opportunities right in the neighborhood, not, you know, see you later, there's a new home for you, not, you know, here. But the goal is one-to-one replacement of the affordable units, but then to add some other opportunities as economic mobility occurs, and as we're able to fill in. There's this footprint, while most of it, I know you guys really centered on Pioneer Homes, but this footprint, there's a lot of sort of vacant housing in the area that needs to be filled in, that needs investment, that we would love to have families participate in those, like taking that vacant house, renovating it and making it their own. And how can we help people do that and encourage folks to stay in the neighborhood and to, you know, Lanasa did a great job. We were part of this sort of planning process that we were talking about preventing displacement and working with, you know, a cohort of people that really think about how can we really prevent displacement. And I'm gonna let her tell her angle, but it was really around, we need to start now in talking about why this isn't, you know, some residents have said, oh, I can't wait to get my voucher and get out of here, or that this neighborhood is something that is incredible, and that where we want to add to the beauty and the richness, and make sure that folks stay in place. So I'll shut up.
I just would add that, you know, there's probably approximately 1,100 units on the footprint of the master plan area. And, you know, there's always the concept of doing the redevelopment in phases so that the vast majority of people who are currently on the footprint can remain. As you do one new area, you move folks from the old area into the new, and just phase it all the way through. In this footprint, we have some existing vacant lands, and around the footprint of the property, as folks on the panel can tell you, there are opportunities for home ownership and other things. But and there will be some residents who may not want to return, or may not want to be in that neighborhood, not because it's not going to be something new and better, but because they just need a fresh start. They need to get out of the neighborhood. For many of them, they want to be there because it's their support system, church, family, work. But for others, they've been maybe a victim of domestic violence and just need to get away and can't wait to get a voucher. They may see opportunity not in that neighborhood, but in a neighborhood that's in New Jersey where their cousin is, and they foresee themselves as an opportunity there because there's work and support system. So the view for what's best for the individual is what really has to rise to the top. And you really want to give everybody that choice. As you said earlier in the program, you don't want to dictate to everybody on the footprint now has to stay. If people really, really want to leave and not come back, they should be given that option. But we're going to but by doing the redevelopment in phases, you give everyone who's on the footprint the greatest opportunity to stay and only move once and not 2 and 3 times to worry about moving in substandard housing and then having to move back. So that's always been the kind of big picture concept that in our approach to the redevelopment.
Unfortunately, it's 7:01, and I suspect we can talk about this for hours and days. But I want to thank everyone. You guys did an amazing job. You're brilliant and thoughtful and considerate. And obviously, I think the instructors did, I think the students did an excellent job as well as the instructors. So thank you for your time and interest in this, and hopefully we get an opportunity to continue this conversation in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also just on myself and Nathan, we want to thank Baye for being an amazing co-host and moderator for this discussion.
Thank you, Baye.
To Sally, Stephanie, Bill, Lanessa from Syracuse, we appreciate you. We appreciate the ways that you've helped to support us in developing this course and in providing guidance to our students. To Razmia and Justin, we appreciate you and your expertise and really grounding and rooting this conversation into a national conversation. And so we appreciate your expertise and presence, all of you. And we appreciate Syracuse University for giving us the platform to have this discussion, to share our work. And to all the participants, to all the attendees, thank you for attending. We appreciate you and your interest in the subject matter.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Excellent work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
That was great.
Indeed, yeah. It was.
Well done, well done.
Great.
Ciao.
So I
Bye.
have the recorded, let me just stop recording now. I think it's still recording, but I'll have the recording.